I saw the seismic signals, and I saw the hotspot increase. At the time, it was when I first wrote a paper, it was up to 136 hotspots, as I recall. And that was a dramatic increase because I'd been watching them for quite some time before that. And kind of the average for the entire West U.S. and Canada was about 10. So using a baseline of 10 to get to 136 is a quite dramatic increase when most of them are not fires. And then getting up to 317 was quite incredible when the baseline was 10. Then looking at seismology, the signals at the volcanoes, we had several volcanoes become active with subduction-specific infill signals. So I was saying the signals are a very specific type, and they're quite identifiable as occurring from magmatic rise due to subduction. Because there's a water intermix that goes on, and it creates a very specific type of signal. The water is under great pressure. It remains, I should probably explain this, water that's carried deep in under another crust is at such immense pressure that it remains liquid, just like you can keep the boiling, keep water from boiling in a pressure cooker at a higher temperature. So the same effect occurs, and it makes the magma more active and lighter, and it, of course, rises as a result. So that was where I started, but then I found so much more information, and we kept getting more. This is part of the progress reports, the updates that I've added into the original paper, and then I got further information from the insider through Steve Quayle that apparently left one of the major agencies and was a very top-level individual, and he gave me some additional pointers of where to look for more information, and I confirmed what was available that I could confirm. So on top of everything else, I've been watching earthquakes around the world, and there's a dramatic increase. From my perspective, and Ron Tyler has been active in using multiple sites to compile evidence that there's a 4 times increase in earthquakes, and there's a corresponding increase in volcanic activity. Well, this is all occurring at the same time that we're seeing a dramatic increase at all of the volcanoes, and that's relative to subduction creep. And
so you're saying this is like something out of the day after tomorrow, like everything's activating right now.
Everything is activating. What I discovered is that there's an intrinsic relationship between the Cascadia megaquakes and the volcanoes. And there's an initial process that occurs, and that is subduction creep. The only thing that restrains the Cascadia from releasing...
What in the world? It cut off. It's trying to reconnect here. Is that correct, or is that what somebody else was saying?
That is correct. But at the same time, I'll throw this in there. When you're predicting, or not predicting, but rather forecasting an earthquake that's on a 320-year cycle this time around, or something very close to it, if I'm early by 2 weeks, or even 3 weeks, I will be very happy because it'll give people time to prepare. And you just can't be late with a forecast for something that is this catastrophic. So there are variables such as solar storms that lab tested confirmed they create heat in silicates, and all of the magma on the West U.S. and Canada, West North America is high silicate magma from the subduction process that has been undergone over many millennia or millions of years. So being high silicate magma, this can be accelerated by significant solar activity, and we just happen to have a solar storm on the way, apparently a G1. Anyway, a significant burst of energy coming in to the Earth, and that can accelerate the process that we have. So, like I say, because of the variables, I would rather be forecasting for it a little bit early, because those variables can pop up, and if I don't allow for that potential, then I'm going to end up being late.
Now, another question. Let me ask you this: How bad is it going to be when Cascadia goes off, in your opinion?
Well,
can you describe what it would look like? Can you describe what it would look like for a Cascadia subduction zone to go off?
Every port city is gone. Everything, probably 180 miles, 100 miles inland, 90% structural loss. Oregon codes, BC codes, and Washington, I understand building codes, and they don't build like California for earthquakes. The building codes for the two states and BC are quite inferior. And because of those building codes, we'll see a much, much higher failure rate than we would see for the same size earthquake in California. The amount of brick building, concrete block building, if you're 80 miles inland, 100 miles inland, and you're inside concrete block, a lot of those concrete blocks aren't even reinforced concrete blocks. They're all going to be down. That's just a house of cards if you're in that type of construction. But sheeting with drywall has no strength. So all of the interior walls don't provide any strength. And if you're sheeting with OSB chipboard, fractures terribly in earthquakes. I've watched the demonstrations. It's part of my 35 years as a paramedic to be aware of these things. Plywood will shear the nails. The only thing that stands up well in an earthquake is shiplap. The multiple board construction. I happen to be in a home that's shiplap both inside and outside of the walls, interior walls and exterior walls. And now I'm beefing up the basement with shear walls because I'm going to get hit with this hard. I might have a house that stands, but I can't guarantee it.
Now, how
I've got one of the toughest houses around.
How high do you think the waves will be?
Well, based on the research that I've done of the Chile quakes, we had a 9.4 to 9.6, and it produced an 82-foot tsunami. That was back in 1952, I believe. And doing a comparative analysis between other quakes, every magnitude increases the, and this is a rough estimate because there's always local variables, but a full magnitude increases the tsunami height by 50%. So if you go from a 9.5 Chile at 82 feet and go to a 10.5, you'll add 41 feet. But there's local variables, because if the fault that you have that's moving, for instance, there's escarpment faults newly discovered off of California, and they found now that it's more common for very large earthquakes to trigger other earthquakes. Chris Goldfinger had some discussion about that.
He confirmed that in my interview with him. I did an hour and 20 minute video.
Very well studied individual. And if he's confirming that, then it's solid science. So there's a strong potential that the new offshore California faults will be triggered by this earthquake. And that's a reasonable thing to be prepared for. I can't guarantee. Nobody knows exactly what other areas will go, but that's a possibility that should be prepared for, because the faults that they've discovered include ridges, which it makes it very probable that they're escarpment faults. And when the Seattle fault has gone in the past, it's moved by as much as 200 feet in a single event. Well, 200 feet under the ocean would produce a tremendous tsunami. Now we're looking at maybe 150 feet, maybe 180 feet. And what has not been considered as part of this is there's known deflection. Because the friction is on the underside of the North American plate, that causes an upward bending of the crust, and that's GPS measured. They've got there's a process called geodesy. They put sensitive measuring equipment on multiple sites, and they can tell how much upward movement there is. Well, the friction on the Pacific plate and the Juan de Fuca plate is on the top surface, so of course it must bend bow downwards. It's also got the weight of the ocean on it. So we're going to get something close to 10 feet of landfall drop when North America spreads out, when the subduction releases, or when the earthquake releases, Cascadia releases. How much is the ocean floor going to move upwards generally as a result of the release of the pressure that's caused a downward bow? And this hasn't been discussed in any of the scientific papers by any of the agencies that I've been able to find. And I've looked.
So I guess what is your call to action? What are you going to let people know in the West Coast? Do they need to, what would you suggest?
I'd go by largely by Mount St. Helens and its historical, because it's a stratovolcano. We got a few fives before Mount St. Helens blew. If you start seeing magnitude 5s, we're seeing magnitude 3 earthquakes at Cascadia volcanoes now. So I've seen them on seismograms, and that's my interpretation. We've also seen plumes off of Mount Adams, Mount St. Helens, and I think Hood had a plume as well. And even the natives centuries ago knew that when they started sending off plumes, it was time to move. So when we see magnitude 5s or a magnitude 5 and an eruption, the Cascadia is imminent. There's days. I certainly don't know, because there's no historical context to fall back on. But the process is one where the friction is reduced and the force remains the same. So it continues to accelerate. It's not a straight line event. The subduction creep is an accelerating process that gets faster and faster the closer you get to the end of it, because the friction is reduced. That's why we're getting multiple melt sites, and it's ominous to go from just a few volcanoes having subduction infill to over 30, if you include the seamounts. That's an absolute warning that this is moving, it's spreading, and it's going to go. It's pure science.
I think the scary part is everybody's thinking in the back of their head, what if this man's right?
This isn't. I'm not presenting an opinion. I'm presenting science. The volcanoes, the signals at the volcanoes can only mean one thing: subduction. And the signals are getting larger and they're getting longer. We had a period of 5 hours of steady infill at Mount St. Helens. That's unprecedented in the year and a half that I've watched. There's been nothing like that in the months before. 8 hours or something close to 8 hours at Rainier. And I have one mariner's account from 1700, a logbook entry that said Rainier was erupting in the last Cascadia, or perhaps Glacier Peak. They weren't sure. But you can't see Glacier Peak. You can see Rainier, so I expect it was Rainier. And Rainier is more active than Mount St. Helens. Also in historical research, the most recent study of Seax Cone, which is off the north end of Haida Gwaii, shows that it erupted in the same time period as the Cascadia. So the range, they didn't nail it down to a year, but they got a range. And Seax blew at about the same time that the Cascadia went in 1700. So we've got a bit of a tenuous, it's not a hard history where there's volcanic activity, but it was well worth researching to see if there's a volcanic connection. Because history is saying that there is, but it's not saying it very strongly. And what I found is there absolutely is a relationship between active volcanoes and the Cascadia going. And it's because the friction zone, that where the friction is released, where the subduction occurs, is under the volcanoes, and it sends the signals into the volcanoes. And it tells us it's moving. It can only be one thing.
Well, Terry Rempel, I'm so glad that we got a chance to talk to you. Do you think people should act now? Do you think that they should have supplies ready and waiting?
The need for supplies is more dire than most people recognize, because with the degree of activities at so many volcanoes, at the same time where there's an earthquake increase around the world and increased volcanic activity, this event is going to be unprecedented beyond what I've written in the paper, in my opinion. I can only go to a 9.5 based on science, but in my opinion, which I can't substantiate by science, it's going to be larger. And because of the 200 trillion tons of liquid carbon that has accumulated under West North America, and that's in the paper as well, that is exceptionally volatile compared to just normal magma. We'll see at least 10 volcanoes go stratospheric, and I expect we're going to have a year volcanic winter.
Well, I hope you are wrong.
I hope I'm wrong too.
I am praying you are wrong.
200 trillion tons is a massive amount, and that came from the Insider, but it's verified to some degree. It's researchable online, where they say 100 trillion tons. So Steve Quayle's Insider, and from reading what his responses were to me, Steve Quayle was the intermediary between the two of us, and he reviewed my paper and said it's basically correct, but there are these factors that he should have covered as well. And then I researched those factors, and that includes, the Insider says 200 trillion tons. The articles that I read said 100 trillion tons, but it doesn't much matter. It's volatile, and there's an awful lot of it. And it starts going, and it's going to take what would be maybe 2 or 3 eruptions that are substratospheric and push them stratospheric, but make it more of them. And the infill signatures at so many volcanoes being so strong say this is what's going to occur. That's what they tell me.
Well, Terry, it was a pleasure to have you on the channel. We are most definitely going to share out this information for those to whom it may concern. And we will most definitely share out your white papers that you put out. Thank you for calling in tonight, Terry. I appreciate you. Yeah, if you have a comment about what he is saying, put it down below, put it in the chat. If you're watching the replay tomorrow, make sure to check the description. We'll most likely have the white papers linked there and even possibly in the comments. So thank you, Terry Rempel, for coming on the show. I appreciate you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And this isn't about anything other than saving lives. This is going to be such an immense, catastrophic event. Without people taking this seriously and taking it seriously rather quickly.
Now, do you have a YouTube channel? Is there any?
No.
So you don't have any motivation. It's not like you're trying to get big on YouTube or anything. It's like this is.
I started out to save my family. I wanted to know about the Cascadia. I knew it was overdue, and I wanted to save my family. And I looked. I did the work. I did the study. I did the research, and by covering 5 different fields. And by covering, instead of one state or just the U.S., I covered Northwest Territories, BC, Washington, Oregon, and then California via hotspots, and then 2 states in as well. So I covered a massive area compared to the agency, but I was focused on one goal, and that was understanding the Cascadia. And I don't think any professionals had that goal in mind, and I just had that goal at the time when it started. I happened to be doing the work at the time when the changes occurred. And I expect if the professionals had been watching the same breadth of area and combining all the sources of data, they would have come to the same conclusion. And perhaps they have, and there aren't telling us. I don't know. That's all pure speculation.
No, they would not tell us. No, I know it. I know it because I've talked to a FEMA and military liaison who says they knew. I mean, they know it's coming, and they're preparing for it. And of course, they don't want to affect it. They don't want to put everybody in panic. They don't want to affect property values. They don't want to affect businesses. They don't want to affect everything that's going on. This especially with Seattle being at the most expensive city in the country right now, or one of the most, it's like number 3 in the country as most expensive because all of the high paid tech people that are coming in here. It's crazy. They're not trying to, but then again, Amazon and others, they're like starting to build other offices because they know that their West Coast office is going to be toast. So, they're all making second campuses now. So, Terry Rempel, it was a pleasure to have you. I need to get somebody else on here, otherwise we're going to drop them. I gave you 4 times the average time just because I wanted to get your message through. I appreciate you, and please come on anytime, okay?
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. We'll be talking in the next few days, okay? All right. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you.